So first of all, to the long-term projection that our PGM project has made in terms of upstream, U.S. as a real contender. And I think when there's technology innovation driven, I give an example to speak to it is, when you look at the semiconductor section, right? And it's very technical, and it requires a lot of technology. It requires a lot of talented labor force, as well as huge capex investment. Mm-hmm. And then now, I mean, in the past, we don't think that's possible in the US, but now you start seeing people are building more fabs, right, in the US. Also, those fab companies also doing investment in Europe. And I just saw a huge announcement from Intel yesterday. They're putting their semiconductor ecosystem sort of supply chain system within Europe as well. So I think this kind of speak perfectly about what's the cost for risk, what's the price for risk. And it's probably not being very much discussed in the past. But nowadays, I think it's really start happening when it's critical, strategically critical to the country's competitiveness or to the region's competitiveness. And then there is a price for the risk, and then people are willing to invest to overcome that, risk.
Yeah, there are some countervailing trends. I agree with you, Helen. Even when it comes to things like rare earth minerals I mentioned earlier, rare earth minerals aren't rare in the sense that they're scarce, from a geographical perspective. They're here in the United States. We just prefer not to mine for them, right? We let other countries mine for them. So we've made both explicit and implicit, or conscious and unconscious decisions about the kinds of things, economic activities, we're willing to support in our country and other places around the world. And those come with trade-offs and risks. The countervailing trend is the rise of a third kind of company that economists have noticed over the last couple of decades. They refer to them as factoryless goods producers, or FGPs. A good example would be Google or Nike, for example. They want to own the R&D, they want to own the brand, but they don't want to own manufacturing assets, which are kind of low margin, right, and highly difficult to run and susceptible to disruption. And so the idea is that if I own the R&D and I own the brand, the profits tend to pool at that level, and I can pay low margin dollars to someone else to make it for me. And there's been a dramatic change in the United States. I don't know if it's going to shift back, but go all the way back to 1970. In 1970, the average member of the S&P 500, 80% of its total cost structure was in the four walls of the firm. In 2020, 50 years later, it was about 50%. And so it's a 60% change, a massive change, actually a revolutionary change in how we think about how firms should organize themselves. It directly related to the allocation of scarce resources that you mentioned earlier, Helen, and the idea that if another company is better at the manufacturing work, why do I want that vertically integrated and do it less well? I'll pay somebody else to do it, and I'll get a better product, and I'll be more profitable. And so the question is whether this movement towards resiliency can overcome the powerful economic imperative of the economic sense that outsourcing makes. And it's an unknown situations, unresolved today. I think the safe bet is we're moving a little bit back in the direction of kind of that sense of more local production. And as the last factor, the United States historically has not been a country that's been very friendly to industrial policy, the way it's practiced in China, the way it's practiced in France and other places, where those countries make a decision around the strategically critical industry sectors that they believe are necessary for their economic security or their military security or both, and they invest. We prefer to let the market forces dictate, which industries thrive, which companies thrive, and which do not. And I think the Biden administration is more open to the argument. Clearly, what's happening in semiconductors and the clear policy out of the Commerce Department today is a form of industrial policy where we're announcing incentives to build up a semiconductor industry in this country, which is not necessarily a bad thing. If nothing else, some of our critical military systems depend on these technologies, and we could be highly vulnerable if those supply chains got disrupted.
Yeah, I would like to offer one piece of data, point that may be helpful to support some of the discussion we had earlier. That from the Global Risk Report in 2022, I think the report was published in January, along with the World Economic Forum. So the economic disruption from the pandemic has also created a stronger incentives for the vaccinated world to prioritize resilience over cost minimization.
Mhm.
And governments and industry may now drive regional convergency at the expense of global integration as they seek to minimize supply chain disruptions. Another thing I thought was very interesting is, so-called climate change and sustainability movement, right? Because the globalization at the same time, the negative part of the globalization also expanding. So through the global effect of climate change, pollution in one part of the world leads to extreme weather events in another, as well as the world's capacity to cope with hazard greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a clear driving force from the climate change and sustainability as well in terms of where should the supply chain positioned and resource being allocated in a way that causes less damage, right, to the planet that we're living. What are your thoughts about that?
I agree. So the folks who publish data on greenhouse gas emissions, have kind of segmented those emissions into three scopes, as they're referred to: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And 80% of greenhouse gas emissions occur in the so-called scope 3, which is actually the supply base of all of our firms. So the only way we can make meaningful impact on, heating up of the atmosphere, CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, and mitigate some of the climate change that we're experiencing, is that we begin to be serious about our supply base. And ISM talks to companies all the time, but where are you in that process? And the answer is none of them are very far along today. So I think a wave of the future. Now, what's her name? Beverly Raskin just withdrew her nomination to be the Fed vice chair of bank supervision. Right? She'd been nominated by the Biden administration. And one of the reasons she ran into trouble in the confirmation process, she's been outspoken as a private about the impact of certain industries on climate change. And she seemed to be advocating the reallocation of capital away from some of those industries and in favor of industries that are maybe more climate friendly. And that's a somewhat controversial point of view. I wouldn't say that's universally accepted right now. On the other hand, the ESG movement is clearly a vehicle for directing capital to more climate friendly companies. I mean, Larry Fink at BlackRock has said this. Banks have made noise about if I'm going to loan you money and you're not a climate friendly industry, you're going to pay me higher interest than someone who is more climate friendly. So if we begin to see allocation of capital based on non-economic conditions, well, arguably non-economic, then that's a big change. I do believe that the triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit, matters to the younger generations for sure. And they make purchasing decisions based on the perceived values of the companies they do business with and how aligned they are with their own personal values. I do think that boards, companies, so many companies have made public pronouncements about we're going to be carbon neutral or net carbon zero by a date certain. It clearly has gotten the attention of, and by the way, ISM data shows it's a top-down driven initiative. So it's driven by the board and or the CEO. But execution, by the way, is usually handed off to the chief procurement officer, chief supply chain officer, who have actually got the relationships where they can make the difference and can measure the improvement. So I do think it's a wave of the future in supply chain. The question is, how fast will we get there?
Yeah, fantastic. So as a tradition of the program, I hope to build an intellectual bridge between the current and future generations. Einstein said, any intellectual fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. So Tom, how would you like to paint a picture for the supply chain economy by giving a new perspective?
Thank you, Helen. I really enjoy the chance to think about this a little bit, and I had a lot of fun with it. And The analogy I'd like to point the audience's attention to is the ocean. Like supply chains, the ocean is constantly in motion. And if you know a little bit about how the oceans behave, there are really kind of three sources of motion in the ocean. There's tidal movement, right, which is kind of close to shore and is related to the gravitational force of the moon, typically. There's surface current movement, which is related to wind currents generated by the thermal energy of the sun, right? And those patterns, which are generally well understood. And there are also deep ocean currents. By the way, those tidal and surface currents you might think of as horizontal movement in the system. Vertically, there's something called a deep ocean current, which occurs at both the North and the South Pole, related to temperature of the water and salinity of the water. But what happens is the water gets colder and saltier. It sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and then it begins to migrate. And it takes, by the way, it takes 1,000 years for 1 cubic meter of water to complete its circuit of the globe in these patterns. So to me, those are the long-term trends, the historical and economic trends that are irresistible. And I think, so I think a supply chain can be seen as not just a horizontal phenomenon, but both horizontal and vertical. And by my analogy, I would say, tidal changes and surface current changes are kind of economic policy changes that are set by countries and governments around the world. But those longer term things like globalization, like innovation, like technological change that are irresistible economic forces, they happen too, and they drive how supply chains develop, as we've seen over the last 30 years. So I think we use the term supply chain because it's convenient, and it connotes the linkages between events that maybe in the past we didn't say as being in sequence and independent. And it also is convenient because it points out that the weakest link in the supply chain is where all the pressure will come. But it really doesn't kind of address how supply chains really operate, which is more as systems. And I think the ocean might be a good metaphor for understanding how the system impacts. It constrains our ability to move within a supply chain because the parameters are set by the system. Just like you're navigating based on tides and currents, your options within a supply chain system are somewhat constrained.
Yeah, I love this analogy. I think the ocean science applied to the supply chain system, how you described the source of motions, right? And how that interdependent from one to the other, and then eventually make that system kind of keep moving, and also very much relevant to today's environment, because we do get probably all the dynamics and the forces, from all different sources of energy that triggered, right, the movement of the supply chain. I love it. Thank you, Tom, for coming up with this brilliant idea. I also have one to share with you. So the supply chain economy is similar to a blueprint for a house. The economic system provides housing for people, including big houses named countries, and small ones called industries. The supply chain network provides backbone utilities to operate these houses by producing and distributing energy throughout the interrelated rooms. Like the gas shortages caused by the Russian-Ukraine war, reliance, congestion, and damage to the utility system will disrupt the people's life. Therefore, each house must efficiently use and exchange the limited resources while protecting the entire system from exposed risks. So it's a complete way to think of a supply chain.
I think that's brilliant. I think that really describes. One interesting thing is that there are some industries that are bigger than a lot of countries. So the size of the house might vary a little bit, but other than that, and the allocation of resources, among those entities is really important. And ultimately, as our friend Tom Linton would say, a supply chain is really materials in motion. I think either one could accurately describe. It's good for us to think systemically about the supply environment and the set of related activities that is supply, and to understand what influences the systemic model, right? And I think we've done a pretty good job today in terms of economic factors of sort of pointing out some of the significant factors that influence the overall functioning of the system and how the system might evolve in the next couple of
Yeah.
years.
We have a few more minutes. I would love to pick the audience question. We have a great question here. The one question is related to the raw material, anything like metals, fabrics, sensor, things like that. It's hard because the availability of the raw material may not be necessary within the region, especially North America. You have given some examples earlier. So the question is really like, how can we make company to invest, to have more availability of the raw material within North America?
Well, you're going to have to change the economic system and incentives. That's for sure. And it's going to come with some costs. In economics, we classically talk about, for instance, pollution. But if we allow the profit motive to run rampant, companies are going to construct themselves the most efficient profit-driving way they can, and they're going to disregard the costs of, like, for instance, pollution. And so a role for a government entity is to say, no, we're not going to accept that. We're going to put some guardrails around that. We're going to promote a healthy environment for people. So we're going to have to accept things like more mining. We're going to have to lower our taxes. We're going to have to eliminate tariffs. And if we do that, then we'll be able to do things. I mean, textiles, we can bring textiles back to this country. And by the way, to the extent that labor costs are a big factor in providing raw materials, we have to think about the country's immigration policy. And I think there are people who would love to live and work in this country at a livable wage compared to where their wage at home. And we have a shortage of workers in this economy. We need immigrant labor to help us.
So that actually connects to the next question. What role, if any, could a university play in developing a workforce that are competing with the supply chain networks in Asia?
Well, so really interesting is the skill set that's going to be required going forward. Much more about tracking a flow of information than it is about the flow of goods. And so understanding how to use data and analytics to anticipate disruptions to supply chain and resiliently and agilely shift so that you don't get caught by that event. We're much better at weather prediction than we were in the past, and so that's less of an impact today. Surprisingly, the number of factory fires in just the last year has doubled. And I don't know if that's, it could be pandemic related. For instance, you don't have as many people on the floor investing in the safety measures around, making sure that the plant is safe. You're just trying to keep production running. So, anticipating those kinds of impacts that throw off the performance of a global supply chain, really important. So being able to use statistical process control, understand machine learning and algorithms, and universities have a real role to play in training a workforce to do those kinds of things.
So Tom, what are the key learnings and takeaways you want our audience to remember?
Well, we're back in a world where geopolitics matters. For the last 30 years, we didn't have to think about it, and companies could take for granted opening global markets and serving global customers. That's not the case anymore. Number two takeaway, the consumer and governments both are very sensitized now to the consequences of the globally extended supply chain, and they're a little uncomfortable with it. And we could see some regulatory pressure and compliance pressure around that. And the third one is compliance overall in supply chains is a much higher concern, whether it's human trafficking, or it's fair labor practices, that's the source of some of these rare earth minerals. So look at the Congo, for instance, the conflict minerals. We're going to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act just came into law in the United States in December. People are realizing this globally integrated economy exposes us to certain kinds of risks and behaviors that maybe we're not comfortable with. And so as supply chain professionals, it's going to become our responsibility to monitor and audit those kinds of conditions and report back to our shareholders, our customers, and to governments about what we're doing about it.
No, that's great. So I actually would like to remind all of our audience, supply chain system serves as a backbone of our society. And everyone probably know more about the supply chain than you realized. And your company is part of supply chain system. And every one of us is actually part of supply chain resources. whether being, wearing a hat as a consumer, a producer, or a distributor. So Tom, I appreciate your partnership exploring the economy and supply chain relationship today. And I also hope this is the beginning of many more conversation about the supply chain economy. I also like to thank everyone who attend our live webinar and also listening to our podcast. Please share with your network if you find our program stimulating and helpful. We look forward to seeing you again in the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I enjoyed it.